team manager Alfred Neubauer watches Juan Fangio take a Mercedes up to the starting point of perhaps the greatest international road race of them all, the Mille Miglia. Another Mercedes in the German team with English ace Stirling Moss at the wheel. And the third is driven by Carl Kling. Ahead of them are 1,000 miles of some of the toughest racing in the world, right across Italy.
This is Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick. My guest this week is motorsport historian Colin Johnston, and the subject is what many consider to be one of the greatest races of all time, the 1955 Mille Miglia. Here's my conversation with Colin Johnston. Enjoy. Colin, I must say, I really enjoy your writing. It is enthusiastic. It's right up my alley. Where did you get this passion for vintage motorsport history?
It's a good question. It's always been with me. I discovered, for people who don't know, I'm from Northern Ireland, so there's a lot of motorsport here, and I grew up going to see the rallying and the motorbike racing, so it's kind of always been in the air here. I discovered Formula One 40 odd years ago, and way back then, kids, what you had to do was you had to go to the library because there was 2 weeks between every Grand Prix, and if if you watched Niki Lauda race on a Sunday and you thought it was the best thing ever, the only thing to do was to go to the public library and try and find some books about it. So inevitably, from the get-go, I was looking back in time to a certain extent. But I just love history. I love motor racing, but I love big personalities and great stories. So that's what's taken me down that route in terms of a passion. And it's evolved to whatever it's become now. By dint of, it's really just the technology's caught up with me. I've been talking about motor racing and motor racing history for decades. And it's just gone from the schoolyard to the workplace to the old internet forums to social media to writing about it now in a wee bit more of a formal way. But yeah, I just love stories and I love motor racing. Before we get into our discussion today, which I think is going to be fascinating for people, I do want to mention your website, which is racingdaydreams.com. And I really encourage people to check it out. I'll have links in the show notes, by the way, Colin. That's very kind of you. Thanks for that. And today, our big subject is what I want to call the Mercedes miracle. Perhaps it wasn't a miracle, but there are some remarkable things that happened. And the center of our story is the 1955 Mille Miglia, which is a 992.3 mile road race through the public roads of Italy. And when was the first Mille Miglia run? I think it was 1928. 27, I think. So certainly in that period. Yep. And it ran for 30 years with a couple of inevitable gaps, but from 27 to 57, I think. And the remarkable thing about the 1955 race is the incredible breakneck pace of Stirling Moss with his navigator Denis Jenkinson in the 300 SLR, the beast of a Mercedes. And here's the thing that's so astounding. In 1945, the Mercedes-Benz factories are smoking piles of rubble. And in 10 years, they have developed this supercar. The technology in it, we'll talk about all that. But I mean, it's so astounding. It is. I read that the great British journalist Lawrence Pomeroy visited Stuttgart in 1946, somewhere about there. And one of the first things he did was he went to see what was left of the Mercedes-Benz works. And if anybody knows a little bit of the history of Stuttgart was hammered. And I think 80% of the Mercedes works, or the Daimler-Benz works, were gone just through air raids and whatnot. And Pomeroy visited the ruins and got speaking to the guy who was acting director of Daimler-Benz at that time. And at the end of the conversation, the director of Daimler-Benz turned around to Pomeroy and said, "When will they let Mercedes-Benz race again?" So he's literally standing in the middle of the smouldering wreckage of their factories. They have no route to market. They have virtually no product. They don't, the country isn't even a national state. But already Mercedes-Benz is thinking about how they're going to go racing again. So I think that's the core of the story that we're going to be looking at. Yes. And I don't know about Mercedes-Benz, but I know that other German manufacturers
produced whatever they could to survive after the war. I know that BMW made pots and pans for a time, just consumer goods, whatever it took.
Yep, absolutely. But this was the second occasion that Daimler and Benz had gone through this, because they had the same situation after the First World War, effectively. Not the same sense of destruction to their works. But I've just recently written a piece for the Mercedes-Benz Formula One website to mark 100 years of the merger of Daimler and Benz to form the Mercedes-Benz company that we know today. And part of that is from the aftermath of the First World War and financial crash and just poverty and just the horrors of recovering from this wartime period. And yes, back then, Mercedes were making typewriters and bicycles, and very much in the same score after the Second World War. They're making do with what they can, and they're pressing as hard as possible to get some sort of production up and running again. Thankfully, they were left with the tooling to their successful 170 road car, their small road car, and off the basis of that, they're able to make a few vehicles and get a start made again. But yeah, it's astounding. I suppose ultimately they had no choice, but it's remarkable. It's remarkable what they achieved in such a short period of time.
Absolutely. And in the 1920s, there's a very interesting figure that will come into our story in the 50s, and his name is Alfred Neubauer. And I tell people about Neubauer. What a character.
What a character. A self-made man, a man who literally not only created his own life and his own caricature, but created an entire profession for himself. He was the man who effectively created the team manager in motor racing. He was a racing driver and a close associate of Ferdinand Porsche. And when Porsche moved to Daimler to work for building the Mercedes cars in the 1920s, Neubauer came with him. Decided that his racing days were behind him. His racing days weren't terribly spectacular in the first place, but basically made the role of team manager for himself because he had observed how crazy races could be. The big trigger for it was the 1926 German Grand Prix, where Rudi Caracciola was winning and he didn't know he was winning. And it was craziness on track. Everybody just went hell for leather in the races, and the timekeepers tried to keep up. So Neubauer was the first man to say, I'm going to take charge of logistics. I'm going to have signals. I'm going to have flags. I'm going to have timing. We are going to be on top of this organizationally. But he could do that because he was such a larger-than-life character. And from the 1920s right through to the mid-1950s, he was the heartbeat of the Mercedes-Benz racing team.
Right. And he wasn't an engineer. He wasn't on the technical side of things, but he was a logistics genius. And he had learned this. Of course, he had natural talent for this process, but he had been a logistics officer in the First War. And he had been in charge of the logistics for mechanized artillery, gun tractors. Those gun tractors, coincidentally, were built by Austro-Daimler, designed by Ferdinand Porsche. That was how they made their first association, I think. So he had this logistics background from the war.
Absolutely. And it came into play when resources were really finite. His first big example of applying great logistics to a problem in motorsport, as I say, in 26, he started this whole thing of we're going to organize the team. Come 1931, when, again, in a dip in the world economy, Mercedes-Benz aren't really doing any racing. But Neubauer entered Rudi Caracciola with a private Mercedes-Benz into the Mille Miglia in 1931. And spoiler alert, they won. And they won with, it was Neubauer, it was Rudi Caracciola and his co-driver, it was Rudi's wife, and it was two mechanics. To cover 1,000 miles of Italy with depots and fuel stops, and against the entire might of Alfa Romeo and all the rest. So that was his genius. That really was his genius. And it comes into play then again as Mercedes-Benz rises once again and returns to Grand Prix racing after the Second World War.
Hey guys, I want to take a quick break to say if you enjoy Horsepower Heritage, there are a few ways you can support the show. Go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage and become a patron. There's a link in the show notes. You can make a one-time donation or you can support the show monthly. It's easy, and for the price of a latte, you can help me continue to bring you more of the people and stories behind the machines. You can also leave 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify because that helps new listeners discover the show. Thanks for your support, and now back to the show. Caracciola, of course, is Italian, but Rudy Caracciola was a German. His family had come from Naples. That branch of the Caracciolo family was in Naples. It was in Germany in I think the 1600s.
Absolutely, the shifting borders and the shifting workforces of Central Europe all through the 19th century. And Rudy Caracciola then was born in Remagen, close to the Belgian border, where his family ran a hotel on the riverside, and was a remarkable character. I don't think gets enough consideration and gets enough plaudits in the grand scheme. In that era, in the 20s and 30s and whatnot, he's rather overshadowed by Nuvolari and one or two others, but Rudy Caracciola was a fantastic racing driver and did some really big things in our sport, and is central to the Mercedes and the Mercedes-Benz story, because it's quite nice. Rudy Caracciola was born in 1901, and he was born something like 2 weeks before the first ever Mercedes car started a race. So there's this sort of symmetry between Caracciola and Mercedes brand. It seems very fitting considering all the great things he did at the wheel of a Mercedes-Benz.
And he would go on to be a 3-time Grand Prix champion in the 1930s.
Yes, 3-time European champion. For anybody not big on the history, this was big-time racing, effectively the equivalent of the F1 World Championship we have today, the European Championship for Grand Prix racing in the 1930s. And Rudy won it 3 times in 1935, 37 and 38 at the wheel of remarkable Mercedes-Benz Grand Prix cars against huge competition with Auto Union and with Alfa Romeo and the rest.
Right. And at that time, by the middle 1930s, of course, Hitler's government was putting a lot of money into auto racing. They wanted to be supreme. So these are the years of the Silver Arrows. Absolutely remarkable streamlining and very advanced technology.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely, there was German government support. There most definitely was. Again, it's maybe slightly over-egged, that side of things a wee bit. What there was potential for these companies to get really good government contracts by proving how excellent they were at their engineering. So there was the German government did put up a stipend to try and get a competitive Grand Prix car at the start of the 1930s. What they didn't anticipate was that Mercedes-Benz thought they were going to get that, no problem. This upstart team of Auto Union, this new Grand Prix car designed by Ferdinand Porsche, stepped up and said, we would like it as well. So the money was split between the two, but there was various bonuses and whatnot. And it is true, the government supported them, but it's also an era when the French government and French people were trying to raise money as well, not very well, to generate a better Grand Prix presence for France. And similarly in Italy, the government was very much behind the racing team. So a real return to nationalism, really, rather like the Gordon Bennett races of the early 1900s. There was this sense that the big nations were stepping up and realizing the importance of Grand Prix motor racing to prove their national strength, just to be the big guys flying the flag, but also to improve their engineering and to improve the quality of their engineers. And the processes that we see today through Grand Prix motor racing are all high-end motor racing, how it can drive on engineering solutions, and it's a great platform to train up engineers to move on to other branches. So it was a great era of really fantastic competitive racing, and as you say, it was technologically from 1932 to 1940, it blazed through technology in terms of the advances made in motor racing.
And of course, the war brings all of that to a swift close. But after the war, do you think, Colin, that Mercedes had a little bit of an advantage over other nations, given the technology that they had developed in the 30s?
I would say they probably did, because when a big part of the story of Mercedes-Benz returned to Grand Prix racing is the fact they come back with fuel-injected engines, which necessarily is a Daimler-Benz technology that has been developed through aircraft engines, primarily. They have an advantage as well because they come from such a strong starting point. You may say, well, England, Britain has come out of the war in a better position. Why have they not developed these great racing cars? Because pre-war, their racing was geared more towards voiturettes and sports car racing, and despite the push, they were never big time at the Grand Prix level. So there was not that starting point. So Mercedes and Daimler-Benz had a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience, and thankfully they had a lot of their big presences within the team, and the great engineers had survived the war. So they were just in a position when there was some finance there was some provision to go racing. Like motor racing today, you can't unlearn what you know. So those guys were eager and ready to go racing again. So I think their big advantage would have been just the previous knowledge within the organisation, within the men who were responsible for the racing team.
Right, and namely that would be Neubauer as team manager, but Rudi Uhlenhaut as the technical director.
Yes, Uhlenhaut's a fantastic character, a really interesting character. Someone I've been looking into recently. There'll be a piece down the line very shortly about Uhlenhaut.
Good.
It's an anniversary of Uhlenhaut's birth. Uhlenhaut was he was born in London. His mother was English, and a fascinating character, a very outward-looking, internationally minded man who, again, after the First World War, was kind of forced to travel with his family and had a very interesting outlook on life, and was a great engineer who came in as an apprentice to Daimler-Benz, started working on road cars. And something that repeats through Mercedes history is the fact that a good engineer is a good engineer. And so often through the history of the company, you see people who have come from the shop floor and have gone on to do great things within the racing team, just by dint of being recognised that they are a talent. And a great engineer is a great engineer, whether they're working on a diesel road car or on a Grand Prix car. So Uhlenhaut very quickly found himself in charge of the engineering side of the Grand Prix team when Mercedes had such a terrible season in 1936, where the development of the car had gone so badly wrong, it was time for a new broom. And he was brought in then to oversee the engineering side of the racing department. And his great talent as well was he was a fine driver, which made the difference. And in an era where not only was there no technical way of measuring the car like we do now with telemetry, etc., driver feedback really wasn't a thing either. We were still at the generation of guys who just jumped in and drove.
In their shirt sleeves, I might add.
Yeah. And this is the era of guys who had come from, cable brakes and no front brakes. And now we're driving this big Grand Prix car. So you just drive it, you just get in and do the best job you can, and you have talent and you get on with it. But Rudy being able to drive himself, then to drive pretty rapidly, he was able to jump into Grand Prix cars, do the laps himself, do the times, and also then traded it. Well, he used the lessons he'd learned from road cars, things that are taken for granted today, things that perhaps Colin Chapman brought in, simple things like, let's just make sure we've got all four wheels on the ground all the time, and the wheels are upright. Like the basics. Let's just keep it simple, guys. It's not supposed to bend, and let's keep all four wheels on the ground. I will take that as a starting point. So Uhlenhaut was a fantastic talent, and then it is elemental to the rebirth of Daimler-Benz and Mercedes after the war in terms of road car production. And then when it's time to go racing again, of course, he's back to his old tricks, in charge of the engineering side of that.
Yes. And so by the early 1950s, Daimler-Benz orchestrates its return to the international competition stage. And the key machine here is the W194, which people will recognize the road car model being the 300 SL Gullwing, but the W194 is a purpose-built race car. It looks similar to a Gullwing, but in fact, not the same car. How do they accomplish this?
It's a really interesting story, and it comes back to, again, this necessity. It's great engineering, but there's an element of make, do, and mend as well, because it's only this handful of years since they had virtually nothing. Very quickly after the war, as I say, they want to go racing. They initially think, we're going to go Grand Prix racing again. That's what we've done. We're Mercedes-Benz. And they quickly run into problems with that. They try to revive old cars from 1939. They take them to Buenos Aires and it goes badly. And, right, okay, what are we going to do? So right from the start of Formula One, when Formula One's really starting to get going, 1948, 49, they're looking at Grand Prix racing again, but they're unsure as how the formula's going to go. Do we bring back old pre-war cars, etc., etc.? And the way the formula was going, things were looking a bit precarious with Formula One. In sort of 1951, it's all up in the air. Alfa Romeo's leaving. The sport's not in great shape. So the board of management backs away from plans that were made. There was plans for a Grand Prix car, and they went, no, hang on. We don't know what's happening with Grand Prix motor racing. We don't know what the formula is going to be. We're not putting the money into that. But instead, let's look at a sports car. But the budget's small. You're going to have to do it off the back as much as possible of production car technology. And as quite often is the case, constraints applied to anything increases the amount of creativity that's required and the amount of creativity that's brought to the problem. So they designed this racing sports car, a small racing sports car, a 3-litre car, straight 6 engine based on a production engine. And what Uhlenhaut does is he designs a space frame chassis for it. Something he's actually been doodling at the end of the war, sort of between jobs. This idea of this lightweight, stressed, triangulated chassis. And they wrap it in this aero-cheating silver body, which is very much like in your mind's eye when you see the Gullwing, cruising through the city or down the boulevard today, that Gullwing look. It very much looks like that. But this was a smaller, purpose-built racing car to go and win the great sports car races of that time. Known today for being the Gullwing, and that was out of necessity. The first ones actually effectively had a small hatch. Just the side windows popped open. The guys had to jump in and out of it a bit. It was a bit like the Dukes of Hazzard. Kind of had to sort of dive in through the window. But that was a bit flaky. And when it came time to enter Le Mans, the Automobile Club de West said, that does not constitute a door. You're going to think again. These are the regulations. So Uhlenhaut went away and looked at where the chassis tubes were, looked at what he could do. And the only solution, because of the high effective sill of this triangulated chassis, was to put in these gullwing doors hinged from the top. And that was just pure engineering. It's the desire to go racing, the constraints applied by it, having to have some sort of production base somehow to it, and the confines of the rules of the Le Mans 24-hour race created Mercedes' greatest sports car, perhaps the first supercar, one of the most iconic cars in the world.
And I'm sure it didn't really matter to the drivers whether it was a window hatch or a door hatch, because that thing was a flying coffin any way you look at it. If it had overturned, there's no getting out of that car.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. It was a fierce wee machine, and it was a quick machine. It was 175 brake horsepower. But yeah, if it's upside down, you're in trouble. Having said that, it was a strong enough car, and the won the Carrera Panamericana, and the car that won the Carrera Panamericana hit a vulture on the highway at high speed. It came in through the windscreen, and not only did everybody walk away, they continued on and won that great road race. So it was tough.
And the Carrera was a bit of a proving ground for the Mille Miglia, was it not? I mean, the W194's first entry into the Carrera Panamericana was 52.
52, yep. It did all the great sports car races that season. It won Le Mans 24 Hours. That was the one where Pierre Levegh in, I want to say it was Talbot Lago,
yes,
did 22 and a half hours or something crazy like that. That famous story where at the end of the race, the car just let him down at a moment's indiscretion on his part, threw away this remarkable potential win, and Mercedes won that. They won that. They won the Carrera Panamericana, and there was the Eiffel Rennen, and there was a support race to the Swiss Grand Prix as well, which ended up being Rudy Caracciolla's last race. And then they entered the Mille Miglia in 1952 with the W194, this first 300 SL. and they finished second and fourth. And in fourth place was Rudy Caracciola, who had won it in 1931 on the Mercedes-Benz SSKL. So an incredible contrast between Ferdinand Porsche's design from the 1930s into the 1920s and this new little racing car. So it was a great drive by Rudy. But they achieved great things considering the origins of the car and the performance of the car, the output of the car. They achieved fantastic results just by dint of great engineering and great organization and great drivers.
And their big competition in these years is Ferrari, Jaguar, Maserati's in there too, but
yep,
they seem to have a technological advantage over their competitors.
They do. And it's interesting because you were talking about this wonder of this return of Mercedes. And it's something in a lot of my writing about Mercedes that I do for my own website or for Mercedes F1. I'm always keen to point out that they had at their disposal what everybody else had at their disposal. They did a better job of it. Because I think sometimes when we look back at Mercedes-Benz across decades, we think of it as being a bit of a steamroller, perhaps. You know, Mercedes turns up and wow, the results, they win everything and then they go away again. But there's as much jeopardy in as hard work as anybody else put in. And the results, quite a lot of results could have tipped the other way and they couldn't have been great successes. But they had that experience from the 1930s that was still really coming into play. They had achieved so many great things. And as I said, they had so much understanding. They did great things with the LB300 SL, but then that was set aside. They had plans to run it into 1953 in a different version. They made a prototype of this first little gullwing. They made a chassis number 11 was a proving ground for what a next generation of that car could be with fuel injection, and it's like a 300 brake horsepower version. But at that time, the route to Formula One was starting to open up for Mercedes-Benz. Regulations were set in place. Formula One had stabilized a bit. Mercedes-Benz wanted to get back into Grand Prix racing. So at the conclusion of that successful 1952 season, they wrapped up the sports car racing for the time being. And actually they put out a press statement in a very slightly high-handed Germanic way saying that basically we have turned up with our sports cars. And as you see, we've won nearly everything. So we're the best. So we're going to go away now. Thank you very much. And
we have nothing more to prove.
It was in polite words. They basically put out a statement, and Ferrari took it particularly badly, as you would expect, and threatened to take it to the FIA and said this is unsportsmanlike and terrible. And if Mercedes are so good, just turn up any circuit of their choosing and we'll beat them. But Mercedes decided that they needed to focus on a Formula One project and return to Grand Prix motor racing. So from that period then, at the end of 52. Through to the arrival in Formula One of Mercedes-Benz at Reims in 1954, their focus really was on Grand Prix motor racing again.
And the car was the W196, which broke with some of the design conventions of F1 at the time. It was much less a torpedo shape and more flat, and it's certainly streamlined, a massive front intake. Really a very futuristic looking car.
Yep. A lot of people focus quite rightly on the streamliner bodied version, which first appeared, the all enveloping bodywork, enclosed wheels Grand Prix car. But I agree with you that the more standard, for want of a better phrase, open wheel version of the W196 was a very unusual racing car for the time. It was fairly low, but as you say, it was wide and the suspension was enclosed by the bodywork. And it was a very different solution to, as you say, to the essentially pre-war cigar tube kind of shapes that we were seeing at that time. But again, forward thinking and a new approach for Mercedes-Benz as well, because in this new formula, it necessitated a 2.5 litre normally aspirated engine, and for 20 odd years more, Mercedes-Benz had been synonymous with supercharging. You know, that had been what brought them so much success in motor racing. So in that regard as well, it was a new way to go Grand Prix motor racing for them. But remarkable success with that and fantastic technology within the engine of that, positively actuated inlets, the fuel injection system, inboard drum brakes for lower unsprung weight, a lever to adjust the back suspension when the fuel load goes down, change the camber, just all sorts of Mercedes-Benz solutions. It was a close run thing as to whether it would appear at that first race. But once it did, and once they got it running cleanly, because that was a tough weekend for them at Rome in 1954, they never looked back. It was a fantastic 2 seasons in Formula One for the Silver Arrows.
Yes, and an elegant car, I would say. The construction of it is not as obvious as, say, a Lancia D50 or the Alfettas. Those cars were much more workshop, I suppose. Does that make sense? Versus the W96, which there's an air of aeronautics in the car.
Yes, I get that. And of course, the Lancia D50 was the big competitor to it, or the car that should have been the big competitor to it. And a car that maybe in some regards was a better Grand Prix car. If Alfred Neubauer had got 3 D50s to run, the D50 might have been made a better showing of things.
Yeah, and I just think it's interesting because all of these companies have a perceived character about them. And there are a million jokes about Italian cars versus German cars. And this is where all that comes from, after all these years of development and different approaches.
Yep, it does. It does. And also there are challenges that are being re-met from the 1930s. So Neubauer and Uhlenhaut knows Vittorio Jano and, knows Enzo Ferrari from the European Championship 20 years before. So, but there's perceptions about cars, and you're right. It comes from that motor racing. It comes from those sort of national ideals embodied in the racing cars.
Which brings us to the 1955 Mille Miglia, April 30th and May 1st of that year. And the Mercedes team includes, of course, the 300 SL Gullwing, but also the 300 SLR, which is essentially a sports car version of the W196.
Absolutely. It shares the same model number because retrospectively, the Formula One car is the W196R for Rennwagen, and the 300 SLR is the W196S for Sportswagen or Sportsrennwagen. So yes, effectively, it's taking the Grand Prix car of the day. I was going to say expanding the capacity of the engine. There was more detailed changes to the engine and the construction, but effectively a 3-litre version of the Formula One engine and modifying the chassis, rethinking the chassis in terms of it being a 2-seater sports car with all-enveloping body. And it was a remarkable thing. They tested the first one at Monza, sort of October 1954. And this new sports car, this new 2-seat sports car, had less drag, was more efficient than the Grand Prix car with the streamliner body on it. They were making step changes all the time and always learning and always applying those lessons learned. So yes, this was a racing sports car, a 3-litre racing sports car designed for the World Sports Car Championship as it was back then, to go after all the big races, and a 3-litre car against competition which was sometimes 3.5 litre, 4.5 litre cars as well. But applying, partially necessitated by it kind of had to be based on the Formula One car. It's the only way it could make sort of business sense, for want of a better phrase, but also with their efficiency and their organisation, they reckoned they had the speed in that 3-litre car to take on all the big players across sports car racing.
The 300 SLR is a slippery shape. From the front, it resembles a Gullwing, but the headlamps are covered and fared back. There's a large air intake for the radiator and a separate air intake for the engine. Short racing windscreen, Perspex windscreen, a 2-place cockpit, and the driver's side has a wonderful fairing that tapers off on the rear. And this car also has an air brake.
Eventually, yes. That's a lovely description of it, actually. That's a really nice description of it because it's an elegant brute of a car. And I encourage anybody who's in Europe, go to the Mercedes-Benz Museum and see it in the metal. It is smaller and prettier and also more frightening looking than it is in any photographs. But yes, it had all those features. The high air intake for the engine on the bonnet was something that had been introduced to the Grand Prix cars as well for 55. Just by dint of them having a different intake manifold and whatnot, and also wanting to get the air for the engine up out of the way of papers and rags and leaves and stuff. But yes, eventually it would have an air brake, the 300 SLR, which was a response really to the disc brakes on the Jaguar. And it was something that it appeared earlier, but it was something that was really brought in for Le Mans for the 24-hour race. And for anybody who hasn't seen it, if you can imagine the whole rear deck of the car being hinged from the very back of the car, so the section behind the driver's head would rise up in one big flap when he actuated a lever, and it would be like a giant sail. It would catch the wind, and he could press a lever and bring it back down again. Brought in, as I said, because they were running these huge drum brakes, which were pretty effective, but they weren't the discs that Jaguar had. But also very quickly, both Fangio and Moss realized that there was an aerodynamic component to this, and that if you maybe actually left it halfway up, going through the S's at Le Mans, this thing pressed down on the rear wheels of your car and you could rocket through there. So it was a prototype sort of movable aero device as well to a certain extent. It probably eventually would have moved on to having disc brakes of their own, but at that time it wasn't an option and the technology wasn't available to them. So what are we going to do? And they come up with this rather outlandish but very effective solution, which of course everybody protested. Everybody protested against it at Le Mans.
You know, I wasn't aware that the air brake was not in place for the Mille Miglia, but it was in place for Le Mans, which, you know, they're only a month apart.
The speed this team moved is incredible. I've always loved these stories, and I've always been interested in these men and Moss and the Mercedes and all. But over this last 3 years, I'm very thankful that I've been allowed to tell some of these big stories for the Mercedes F1 team, which has given me the time and the impetus to really dive in deeper. And when you start looking at, as you start looking at timelines and you start looking at things that are achieved, it's crazy. It rivals motorsport today. And again, it's something that I'm always really keen to point out, that these men were just like us. The Mille Miglia, for example, they're doing all their training for the Mille Miglia, and the race is approaching on the last day of April. The cars themselves are only built in March and April of 1955.
Incredible.
And I've got a book up there on the 300 SLR. I call it the Bible. It's on the top shelf there. It was recommended by the museum, and I managed to find an English version of it. And it's the chassis by chassis story. And all the cars for the Mille Miglia, all these most famous cars, the chassis are all welded by one guy over the course of 2.5 days. You know, and you can see that this guy, you know, did 2 in the morning and he had his lunch. And when he came back after the lunch, the next one he welded was slightly heavier than the one he made before lunch. So they're just the timelines and just what we're coming back to, the organization and the precision and the logistics were just outstanding.
We should also mention that the bodywork is of electron, which is an exotic magnesium alloy.
Yeah, of course, infamously at Le Mans, that would be a very bad thing. But yeah, very much cutting edge of its time, trying to save as much weight as possible.
Colin, you mentioned these men, these remarkable men. And so let's talk about this team of drivers that Neubauer has assembled. Who's the heir apparent in the Mercedes team? I think it's Carl Kling, is it not?
Per Carl Kling, he should have been the heir apparent, but from the get-go, really, Mercedes wanted Fangio.
Of course.
From very, very early days. Carl Kling, of course, is the great German hope for motor racing and was a very fine driver. But from early days, from like 51, when Neubauer and Uhlenhaut are going to Formula One races and sort of really closely looking as to whether Mercedes can get in at this point into motor racing, they realize that Fangio is the guy. For people who don't know, or people who maybe think of Fangio as this cheery, chubby bloke in an old newsreel film, Fangio arrived in Europe like Max Verstappen. Okay, he was an older guy, but Fangio arrived from Argentina 1948-ish, but 1949, that summer of 49, he arrived as the real deal, fully formed, and just won race after race after race after race across southern France and Italy in 1949. I was like, wow, this guy. So very quickly, Mercedes said, and I think it's in one of the memos when they were talking about reviving their pre-war Voiturette, the W165, as a potential Formula One car. Neubauer said to the committee, he said, with Fangio and that car, we can win. But the thing was, they needed Fangio. So Fangio was very much the figurehead of it. Long story short, they eventually got him. They wooed him for years, and they got him in the team when they arrived in Formula One. But Fangio was the man. But Carl Klinglen, yes, ended up rather playing second fiddle to Fangio, certainly in that 1954 period. But really, Ullenhout had also realised that, in his words, driving had changed. In 1951, when they were looking at bringing back the old cars, Rudy Caracciola had said, I'm not interested anymore. These cars aren't great. Our time's done with these. And Ullenhout wasn't sorry to lose him in a way, because Ullenhout had realised by watching these new generation of drivers that driving had changed. And in his line, it was people run faster, people swim faster. Why shouldn't they drive faster in the 1950s? So Kling was awfully old school, perhaps, and just didn't have the speed that a man like Fangio had. But then, of course, they wanted to bring on a second generation, a new generation. And amongst that, on the German side, was Hans Hermann, who passed away most recently. And, of course, some young fella from England by the name of Stirling Moss.
Yes. And Moss caught Neubauer's attention because he saw Moss doing very well in cars that were not so competitive.
Indeed. Like Enzo Ferrari had seen Moss before. Moss as a kid had won the RAC Tourist Trophy over here, actually, at Dundrod in a Jaguar. And I caught Ferrari's eye, and then Ferrari had lost his chance with Moss. Neubauer had spotted Moss, giant killing in small cars and Formula 3s and in Formula 2 races and whatnot, and had basically said to Moss's father, Alfred, we're interested in the boy, but we need to really see what he can do. We need to see him in good machinery. So the father went out and bought a Maserati, bought a 250F for the 1954 season. And Moss did great things in that. Moss did a really good job in that. And that was sort of his proving ground. And then, was signed up for the 1955 season for Mercedes-Benz, for both Formula One and for the Sports Car Championship with this soon-to-be released new racing sports car, the 300 SLR.
Moss had a little bit of this in his blood. Of course, his father, who was a very successful London dentist, had been an amateur driver in the 1930s. And in fact, I think even Moss's mother did a bit of racing herself.
Yeah, his father raced in the Indy 500, had a start, and I think he finished the Indy 500. I want to say
14th.
26th, 14th. Yeah, there we go.
I think it's 14th, yeah.
Yeah, cool. And yes, his mother was, Muller did rallying. His mother was very talented, and the family was involved with show jumping and horses as well. His mother was a talented driver, as of course was his sister, Pat Moss, who was a fantastic rally driver. I don't think she gets enough credit. She's always talked about in terms of winning the Coupe de Dame prizes, whatever. Pat Moss was as good as many of the men, if not most of them, back in that era at the end of the 1950s and start of the 1960s. She was a great rally driver. So yes, a talented family, and also a modern example. People talk sometimes about it being a modern phenomenon of sons of racing drivers and sons of wealthy people, or people with disposable income, are the ones who make it in motor racing. And it's interesting to look back as Stirling Moss, a great natural talent of our sport, also came from that slightly privileged background, and also came from a background where motorsport was front and center in his family when he was growing up.
And Moss had already developed a reputation for being able to drive just about anything. Fangio was the same way. Later on, Jim Clark had that reputation. Some drivers were exclusively F1, others were exclusively sports car, but Moss seemed to be able to do it all. In 1955, he's 26 years old, which is an old man by today's F1 standards, of course. But he did race F1. And so the Mercedes team, we've got Stirling Moss, Juan Manuel Fangio, Carl Kling, Hans Hermann, and an American, John Fitch, who was, I think, a fighter pilot in World War II, and a very analytical guy, and later on contributed quite a bit to safety in racing.
Absolutely. John Cooper Fitch. I would love to have had a drink with John Cooper Fitch. What an amazing character. Great sports car racer. Did a couple of Formula One races as well. Was part of that Mercedes team that raced the W194 in 1952. Had raced in the Carrera Panamericana and had been part of that group back then. And as you say, was an aviator in the Second World War. I believe he was the first man ever to shoot down a jet fighter.
That's right.
Over Germany. And it was the German Mercedes-Benz press guy, I think, was in the Luftwaffe during the war. And the two of them used to share a car on long journeys and trade stories. And the idea that all the old aviators were all gentlemen, and that business was all past now. So we'll talk about it in a very gentlemanly way and share our stories and share our experiences. But he was a fantastic character. Yep, and talking about this 55 race, John Fitch is central not only to the performance of one of the cars in the race, but he's central to the story as to how and why the winning Mercedes-Benz was able to go so fast, because he was the guy who, along with another man, came up with the idea that we could use pace notes to go faster in long-distance sports car racing.
The first formal use of them, I guess you'd say, was in the Carrera Panamericana, was it not?
It was, yes. In that 52 race, they had notebooks effectively. And yes, they very forward-thinking. Again, just another example of a simple thing and great organization and planning. If you're scouting the route and you're driving the route, you might as well make notes. So that had been successful back then, and John Fitch was aware of that. The sports car program was approaching with Mercedes-Benz for 1955, and he thought there might have been a way back in there for him again. He was still in touch with the guys. I believe he lived in Switzerland. So he thought there was maybe a way back in there. And he had been talking to the great motor racing journalist, Denis Jenkinson, and they'd been chewing the fat over this. And they basically had decided that the way you would go about these long distance races would be you would take a co-driver and you would use these pace notes. And if you worked it out, you would use your co-driver effectively as an auxiliary brain, just give him all the thinking in terms of what's coming up ahead. And you would relay it to the driver and the driver would know what to expect. And this is the way forward. And they thought, if you get in the Mercedes team, we might be able to try that out sometime. That sounds like a good idea.
I mean, after all, at 150 miles an hour and greater, you really need two brains.
Yeah, especially in these machines on the open road. For anybody who hasn't really got it yet, the race we're talking about is a 1,000-mile single loop around Italy. You could spend a lifetime learning it, but something that's a small bump in the road, or 100 mile an hour at 170 mile an hour, is a whole different proposition. It was a really great approach, but how to do it then was then the big idea. How can you do this in an open car? How can you really make this happen? And so those two men had talked about it, and then Stirling Moss was signed for the sports car team, and John Fitch found out that there might not be a place for him on the team. Eventually there was. Eventually he was given a 300 SL road style gull wing as an entry for the Mille Miglia. But when it became apparent that he wasn't going to get the big drive and Stirling Moss was going to be one of the sports car team, Stirling approached Jenks and said, "I've heard you've had this idea. What about it?" And Denis Jenkinson went back to John Fitch and said, Would you mind terribly if we move forward with this big idea we had, but me and Stirling Moss?" And Fitch said, "Absolutely, it's the way to go. Try to make it happen. Go and win the Mille Miglia."
Denis Jenkinson in 1955 is 35 years old. He's the continental correspondent for Motorsport magazine and a former sidecar racer and a bit of an eccentric, wouldn't you say?
Yes. Sadly, I never met the man. But by all accounts, yes. Eccentric in all the best ways. As you say, he was 1949 world champion with Eric Oliver, a 1949 sidecar championship. And he discovered motor racing in the 1930s when he was at school, had spent more years as a conscientious objector and had worked in engineering, and during that time had begun to become involved with Motorsport magazine in England. And by this period, he was, as you say, the continental correspondent, covering all the big races, basically from Easter to Halloween every year. Denis Jenkinson, Jenks, as he was fondly known, or DSJ, as he was known to his readers because his initials appeared at the end of each piece. Jenks would live out of his car, effectively, across Europe, from race to race, following the motor racing scene, sending his reports back. And as you say, he was eccentric, but he was brilliant and opinionated and forthright and analytical. And I mean all those things in an entirely positive way. He was the archetype, and he's the man I think that everybody who writes about motor racing looks up to for his style and his passion and his exactitude, and just that warm feeling of drawing you into the sport as well. He was a remarkable writer and a really interesting guy.
He was a little bit of a proto-beatnik, if you ask me. I mean, he had the kind of longish, almost a goatee, but kind of too long to be a goatee, horn-rimmed glasses, not a flashy dresser by any means, kind of just a basic shirt sleeves type of guy, bumming around the continent in a car or on a motorcycle following the racing. I don't think he ever married. He kind of lived in a little tumble-down shacks from time to time, sometimes without even any running water or electrical service. I mean, just a very fascinating guy. He was singularly focused on motorsport. That was the most important thing in his life, and much beloved to his readers. Also, quite an opinionated writer.
Yes, excellent. Should be more of them.
Well, I mean, after all, so much equivocation is done in automotive writing because there's that impulse not to upset corporate automotive industry.
And nowadays, it's all about access as well.
Yes.
We live in a world now where your accreditation may be held over you. So, but back in Jenks's day, he would just rock up in his little Porsche 356, park in whatever field the racing drivers were parking in, and just walk into the paddock and start talking to people who were his friends, or I say friends, no doubt a lot of them were friends. He was also very opinionated about some of the people he was seeing every week in these paddocks. You know, he no holds barred in terms of his reporting, and all the better for that. But yeah, a different world, but a fantastic writer.
Jenks is Stirling Moss's not so secret weapon. And they have, of course, you talked about the pace notes. Jenks has an innovation with the pace notes, which Moss calls the toilet paper roll.
Yes. So in the Mercedes fashion, there's all this training and practice is going to happen for the Mille Miglia. They've got this 1,000-mile race. So technically, and in terms of the drivers, there's so much to be worked through and worked out. And as part of this, the drivers are going to do so many laps and work over sections of the circuit again and again to learn it, and also to run the numbers in terms of fuel efficiency and tire wear, all the boring things you need to do in motor racing to be successful. So Jenks starts about taking notes as they go, and they start generating these notes, and he has pages and pages and pages of notes, and every time they go over the route, they fine tune it, and he's sitting at 150 mile an hour, sitting in a saloon car, scribbling away. So the problem is, how are we going to relay this message? How's this going to work in a 170 mile an hour open top sports racing car racing around Italy? So two things. First of all, they decide that they're going to have to rely on hand signals. Interestingly, did test a headset system at Hockenheim. Being Mercedes-Benz, there's also a solution. We'll give you microphones and headsets, very modern, and you can go with that. And Stirling very quickly realized that when he was going flat out, when he was going, as Jenks would describe it, 10 tenths, really going for it, that he couldn't hear anything anymore. And apparently they talked about it with a doctor later who said that's true. That's a psychological thing, that when you're concentrating so hard, other senses shut down to a certain extent. So they binned the idea of headsets and microphones and decided that they would relay directions and instructions to each other by hand signal. Interestingly, Jenks always said then that he didn't know much about these rally driver types because he knew from experience that pace notes and headphones don't work. So, he was quite dismissive of modern rallying. But how then to deal with all these pages and pages of notes that he had generated? And in the end, Stirling commissioned a small aluminium box to be made, a roller box, 2 rails and knobs on the outside to twist through, a narrow 18-foot long piece of paper. And on that was written all of these directions, mile by mile, marker stone by marker stone, corners, town centres, stops, hay bales, jumps, level crossings, all written out by Jenks on this bit of paper that he'd all taped together and made this big long piece of paper wrapped onto the roll. And he could sit with this toilet roll holder on his knee and wind his way through the directions and relay these directions to Stirling as they went flat out to win this motor race. And it proved very successful. It worked very, very well.
He wrote it in shorthand, right? Because after all, you can't do longhand in this situation.
Yep, it was symbols mean notes rather, like a mix between what you would identify as like a modern rally pace note and like tulip diagrams, that kind of thing.
Does that toilet paper roll still exist?
Last I heard of it, Stirling always had one in his office at home, but I believe it wasn't the original one. I believe, and I don't know what's happened to it since, but I believe that Jenks always refused to give up the original one and held on to it. So after Jenks passed away, I'm not sure what happened to it. I don't know if Mercedes-Benz have it or what has happened with the original one.
Well, I mean, it's a marvelous artifact and hopefully it's still out there somewhere.
Oh, I'm sure it is. I must ask, perhaps Mercedes Museum have it somewhere.
So, as you say, they've pre-run the race several times over. Characteristic of Alfred Neubauer, nothing is left to chance. Colin, the race begins in the wee hours of June 1st, pre-dawn, and the slower cars are off the line first, right?
All sorts of little, as Stirling Moss always said, every hairdresser in his Fiat 500. Loads of tiny cars. There was Lambrettas. It was, there was 2CVs. It was myriad Fiat 500s. And then working up through all different cars. Then as you get past midnight, you're getting quick saloon cars. And Mercedes-Benz had these World Championship 300 SLR racers going for the big win. As I've said, they also had 2 or 3 300 SL, effectively the road going Gullwing that we know today. They had some of those. They also had 3 or 4 diesel Mercedes-Benz saloons. They were going for that class as well. And again, very modern way, want to promote their technology and sell more diesel Mercedes-Benz. So I don't think there's ever been a works team that has turned up with a greater range of cars to enter for one race, from a 170 diesel to a 300 brake horsepower top of the line racing car. So all through the night, these cars are going, and the early cars just have regular race numbers. But when you start to get into the cars that are the big cars going for the win, they have a race number assigned to them that corresponds with their start time. So we see the example famously that Stirling Moss and Denis Jenkinson are going to start their Mercedes-Benz at 7:22 in the morning. So their race number famously is 722.
In big block letters.
And there's one really interesting fact about that, one really just lovely synchronicity. Mercedes-Benz are going for the win in the Mille Miglia. The only time previous to this, in all the years that the Mille Miglia, the proper Mille Miglia was won by a non-Italian car, was that time in 1931 when Rudy Caracciola won it on the Mercedes-Benz. That's the only time. Rudy Caracciola crossed the finish line in Brescia to win in 1931. And the time that Rudy crossed the finish line was 7:22 in the morning.
Wow. I did not know that.
I've got goosebumps now. I got goosebumps when I worked that out years ago. And Stirling Moss and Denis Jenkinson are sitting in the pre-dawn in Brescia with 7:22 on the side of their Silver Arrow sitting on the start ramp.
Incredible. 24 years later. I suppose the greatest competition is from Scuderia Ferrari. The primary machine for the team is the Ferrari 376S, which is a straight 6 designed by Lampredi, and it's a 3.7 liter displacement, 280 horsepower. So a little bit less than the 300 SLR, but also a lighter car, I think.
Yes, they also had a bigger car. Obviously, they knew the threat that Mercedes-Benz was. And this is Ferrari's home territory. They own this race. And this is the big challenge that they set down in 1952 when they were so hacked off by the press release from Mercedes-Benz. This is the moment, where they said, you said, Mercedes, you had the best cars in the world. We'll duke it out on the roads of Italy. This is that moment. So Ferrari has to step up to the mark. So yeah, they had that 3.7. They also had a bigger car again. They had a 4.4. They had a 4.4, which was 360 brake horsepower.
Right.
Which is shoehorned into a chassis. So there's a mix of these cars, but they're big capacity, high powered cars. This really is Ferrari giving everything they've got. Again, as a contrast that perhaps Mercedes-Benz are organized and have formulated and have calculated how they're going to do it. And there's this sense perhaps that Ferrari are just like, let's just put together the quickest thing we can. The two approaches.
Right. The 4.4 liter car is a privateer entry, though, is it not? It's Eugenio Castellotti.
I believe Castellotti, I would need to check. I thought Castellotti was a works entry, but I could be wrong. I thought it was a last minute car.
Oh, could be.
That Ferrari put together, because I think they maybe put that big engine in a different chassis. I would have to double check, but certainly part of the greater Ferrari assault on the race.
Right. And of course, it's common practice that privateer entries do have some factory support after all, and they're hedging their bets.
Yeah, it's the greatest drivers they can assemble for the Mille Miglia because they really feel that there's a threat from these silver arrows, and they're right to be worried.
Moss and Jenks are off, and immediately they're trying to catch not just the Ferraris, but a couple of their teammates.
Yep, cars are all set off at minute intervals, so everybody's racing off into the dawn themselves and heading the open road. But it's apparent really quickly that the Ferraris are super quick. Heading out of Brescia, heading east across the bottom of Lake Garda, heading towards Verona. And very quickly that Moss and Jenks are aware that Castellotti, who started after them, is this red dot in the rearview mirror. And he is super fast. And this is really disheartening because if they can see him, he's made up a couple of minutes on them already. So they arrive at Padua, nose to tail, and they arrive at 150 mile an hour coming into the town centre. This is what this racing is like. If anybody's done a lovely holiday in that part of the world and tootled about in a rental Fiat, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine charging into these ancient town centres at 150 mile an hour. Nose to tail, side by side. But yes, disheartened by being caught so soon, you arrive in the town centre and Moss makes an uncharacteristic error and locks up the brakes in the SLR and goes straight on through the straw bales and has to sort of slot it into first gear and recover. And they're in position then to watch Castellotti leaving town, blasting out of town, but they see he's leaving black trails of rubber behind him with every gear change. This is a monster car, but they're thinking, that can't last.
Yeah, he's beating on the car. Well, I mean, they all are to a degree. That overshoot by Moss, he misses that turn. I don't know whether that is just Moss being overexuberant. Maybe there's a little bit of a momentary miscommunication between them, but no matter the circumstance, he's into the hay bales. That could have been the end of their run right there. Luckily, the car holds together. It's not catastrophically damaged.
No, it's not. And when you look back across the greater history of these cars across the season, it's remarkable how robust these Mercedes-Benz racing cars are. And that one car in particular, we'll get there no doubt, but this particular car that Moss is on this day, this is chassis number 4 that has been built, and this is its first outing. And this actual individual car will be synonymous with Stirling Moss for forever because he will race it across this season and will achieve remarkable things. And the overarching story is this car can take whatever you throw at it. And so it is proven, luckily straight away. But on they race in to Ravenna on the coast, which is the first control. They arrive in there and not that they know it, but the word is that Castellotti's the fastest, or virtually the fastest. I think the two Ferraris are very similarly timed. And they discover that Castellotti's having to get rear tires put on. So there's a sense that they don't know that they're behind. They feel they're behind because he's been so quick, but there's a silver lining. The Ferrari's eating its tires already. So they've now arrived on the Adriatic coast. They've gone through that lovely valley and that south of Lake Garda. They're now on the coast, and they're on that coast road running all the way down to Pescara. And already the Ferraris are having various tire troubles. This is going to be a theme that the Pirellis just aren't up to the heat. It's an incredibly hot day, and they aren't really up to the torque of these big engines that Ferrari have opted to run. So yeah, now they're on the Adriatic coast, heading south on the road to the sun, and this is a really flat out section, and they're sitting for long times flat to the mat, and for an SLR that's geared for this race is around about 170 mile an hour, and at that speed you're relying on Jenks's notes, and if Jenks went flat out, Stirling kept his foot in it. They're in their groove now, racing along at top speed, undulating, and it's a hot day, and Jenks suddenly feels unwell with all this heat and vibration, the bouncing off his car at 170 mile an hour, decides he's going to vomit, so turns his head over the side of the car, and in that moment, his glasses are blown away by the airstream. But it's Jenkinson, and it's Mercedes-Benz, so there's always a plan B. So he reaches in, and there's a spare pair of glasses, and he puts them on, and he continues like nothing happened. And crazy stories like that. It was on this stage as well, on this stretch, heading down to Pescara, at 170 mile an hour, things happen in a bigger way. And it was on this stretch that for the first time, the SLR 722 actually took to the air over a large hump in the road. And again, something that at 100 mile an hour in training was okay. At 170, all of a sudden it was four wheels off the ground. So, and as Stirling always says, that's a scary thing. Stirling used to tell the story. You're in the air and you don't know, is it there or is it there? So you just have to sit and wait. I just wait and hope that it comes down four square and you're all right. But they race into Pescara, which is the first control and the first service depot. Pescara was like a 30-second stop, which is remarkable because they're already 200 odd mile into this race, and it was enough fuel to get them over the mountains to Rome. If you imagine they're going to cross the top of Italy, they've come down the Adriatic coast, and now they're going to cross over the mountains, cross to Rome. The car isn't even turned off. They fuel it up. While they're fueling it, in this 30 seconds, a policeman takes exception to this racing car sitting running hot with fuel being poured into it and tries to reach into the car to turn it off. In a fantastic scene then, Jenks slaps at the policeman and Moss bangs it in the first gear and they go ripping off from the pit stop, wheels spinning, up out of the town. And again, Stirling makes his second mistake. It's through the straw bales and up over a pavement and clatter, clatter, clatter. But the car's still going, and out of town they head across the mountains to Aquila in the mountains, heading towards Rome.
To trust the car at that point, it's a dodgy thing, right? You don't really know until you're at speed if you've actually broken something, if a spindle is loose, if a wheel has been bent. It's a big gamble.
Absolutely. These are remarkable cars, these 300 SLRs, and this chassis number 4. If any car has a soul, this 300 SLR chassis number 4 is that car. Stirling had seen it before. I would see it again with, sorry to be a bit of a cliche, but with Italian cars. In Italian sports car races, and later Mille Miglia, he will have a brake pedal. It just snaps. But these machines are fantastic. They're fast and they're so robust, which is what you need for this old school road racing. They charge for the mountains, and Jenks tells about how in the mountains really Stirling really came into his own, how it was an absolute privilege. Jenks was fearless when he'd been a motorcycle sidecar racer and could sit with his notes, but also sit and observe and Stirling at work and be so aware of it and acknowledge that it was such a privilege to sit next to a master like us and watch him dice through the mountains in this remarkable racing car.
The trust that they had in each other, it can't be underestimated.
No, I can't. Absolute.
And there's a long history of catastrophe in the Mille Miglia. I mean, many drivers have lost their lives over the years. So now they're hurtling toward Rome, basically the halfway point.
Rome is the halfway point. They're at Aquila in the mountains, and then it's a downhill rush towards Rome. And if I remember correctly, it was on that stage that they hit a level crossing rather too fast. And again, the car takes to the air. There's a sense through it that they never quite know where the competition are and what everybody's doing. They get a couple of times they get handed a note as to what the positions are, but their sense is that they just have to race as fast as possible. Stirling thought if we could do this at a 90 mile an hour average speed for the 1,000 miles, that would be like 2 or 3 mile an hour over the record speed. If we could just do that. So they're really going off that sense, and they know how fast the Ferraris are. They don't know who's out and who's in the race. And because it's a sense that the cars are all set off separately, only occasionally see other competitive cars that they're actually racing for the win. And they're racing down from the mountains down into Rome, and this will be Taruffi's territory. That Taruffi knows these roads, and they don't know it yet, but they're only just leading. Just about, with all this chaos that's happening around him. And there has been all sorts of crashes and technical troubles for different drivers. And the road into Rome is just deep with spectators. And again, if anybody's in any doubt, these are roads that are closed in terms of somebody has nailed a notice to the lamppost to say the road's closed for the Mille Miglia. But, mullers with prams, dogs, postmen on bicycles, you never quite know what's going to appear from a side street. Like you would see the rally spectators in Portugal in the 1980s, they all press in and just open in time for the car coming. Stirling talks about how he had to slow a bit, but Stirling decides if he's going to have to clear these people, he's going to have to wiggle the car up the road. And at flat chat, he's wiggling this SLR so that the people scatter out of the way. And they arrive into Rome, and the stop for service. And for the first time in 500 miles, for the first time in hours and hours, the SLR is turned off for a minute or two. If I remember rightly, Stirling had to use the facilities, but it turned out the point that he decided previously that he would be able to run behind a building and have a quick pee before jumping back in, now has a grandstand on it. So I think it maybe wasn't quite as private as what was anticipated when he was scouting the route. At this point now, the 300 SLR gets a tank of fuel, and it gets 2 rear tires. And as I say, that's all it's going to need over this 1,000 miles. And they set off again. And at this stage, the competition's starting to fall away. Kling and Herman and the other Mercedes are still in the race and going pretty well. They're behind Moss and Jenks. Fangio is having a torrid day. Fangio's SLR hasn't run cleanly all day and has pretty much been on 7 cylinders all day. Having said that, and considering that, Fangio isn't that far behind. Fangio put in a fantastic drive. In terms of the red cars, Taruffi is really the only one left in the mix. But again, the drivers only get a small sense of this, so they just have to keep extracting as much performance as they can and just press on.
Among the Ferrari pilots, Paolo Marzotto has had an accident.
He had a big one early on, yep.
Castellotti, where's he in the mix?
Castellotti, on the Adriatic coast, it finally blew up. He had stopped for tyres that time, and then engine or gearbox went bang. He was flat out from the get-go, and in 150 miles it was all done.
Yeah. 722 is holding together remarkably well, and they're off again.
They're off again, heading north, ultimately kind of towards Siena now. Kling in the sister car has had a slow stop, and they've had trouble getting a rear wheel off that, and he's frustrated, and he sets off out of Rome. And just on the edge of Rome, he has a big crash, and a spectator steps in the road, sort of to avoid the spectator, and the SLR hits a tree. And they're okay, but they're out of the race. Kling breaks some ribs and is out for the rest of the Formula One season. Fangio continues on. Taruffi at this stage is still in the fight. And young Hans Hermann is having a really good race on the other SLR and is keeping within striking distance of Stirling Moss. I want to say maybe about 4 minutes between them at this stage. So there's all to play for, and the leading contenders, there's only about 10 minutes between maybe the top 6 contenders for this race. So it's still all to play for. And of course, there is the old adage, the Mille Miglia in the motor racing, that he who leads at Rome never wins a Mille Miglia. After the fuel fill, it's not clear if the fuel filler wasn't quite right or if it was overfilled. But at one point, they go round a corner and the fuel sloshes through either the vent or a cap that's not quite 100%, and fuel sloshes over the top of them. Covered in high-grade fuel, but Jenks just misses 1 or 2 notes, and Stirling's all right because he remembers this part of the road, and they continue on. But it's on this stretch of the road then, heading towards Siena, that Taruffi's car finally gives up. And unbeknownst to Moss and Jenkinson, they're leading the race. They don't know that Taruffi's out. They don't know how bad a day that Fangio is having. And actually at Siena, Mercedes will try to replace the injector on Fangio's car and try to make it better. And they aren't aware that young Hans Hermann is keeping them honest. And in this regard, it looks like a two-horse race between the two Mercedes of Stirling Moss and Hans Hermann as they head towards the passes, Radicofani Pass and the Futa Pass, heading back into the mountains, heading north again towards Brescia.
Yeah, and this may be the most treacherous section in terms of its geography and road conditions.
Yes, it is, and it comes as well after so many hundreds of miles of racing, where men and the cars are exhausted. And that's what happens to Moss and Jenkinson, because on the Radicofani Pass, unbeknownst to them, they've been running out of brakes on the 300 SLR. It's not apparent to them, because again, it's amazing engineering. They would find out later, or Uhlenhaut would work out later, that they had just miscalculated the wear. There was not enough friction material on the shoes and these giant drum brakes that it had. But thankfully, the Mercedes was designed, instead of the drum brakes being hinged and going like that, they were designed with two cylinders, so they went like that. So, as long as there was metal left on the shoe, metal to metal, they would continue to self-adjust. So they didn't realize they were running metal to metal. And at the top of the Radicofani, Stirling touched the brakes and one wheel grabbed and the car spun around and ended up in a ditch. But again, this remarkable tough racing car in the bottom gear, and he guns it and it drags itself out of the ditch on the top of this mountain pass. He gives it a wiggle. It's fine. And off they go again.
Oh my goodness. Edge of your seat stuff right there. Now, is it true that Moss had popped a Benzedrine pill at some point? I mean, during the war, pilots on both sides were taking pep pills in order to stay awake on those long sorties.
I believe so. I believe Fangio used them once and again. I believe that Stirling took one of Fangio's pep pills. Ultimately, spoiler alert, when this race is over and the celebrations are ongoing, having raced 1,000 miles, and having attended celebrations in Brescia, Stirling, without any sleep, then jumped into a car and drove to Stuttgart to celebrate there as well. And from there, again, just kept going and went on to Cologne. So I think Stirling was well awake for the couple of days around the Mille Miglia. But it's a fascinating bit of history. It is. Obviously, it's something that wouldn't be acceptable or allowed under sporting rules nowadays, but it's another sign of those times, not thinking, as you say, leading back to the war years.
Right. Now we would categorize that as a performance-enhancing drug and you'd be out.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And, even at 150, 160 miles an hour, on a long straight stretch, you could easily be lulled into shutting your eyes, and that would be it.
Absolutely. Yeah. The drone of the engine. It's an incredibly hot day. It's a really hot day. And you've got the engine and gearbox bleeding all this heat into the cockpit as well. Yep. So if you're sitting there and the drone at 170, the head would nod. It could.
So out of the mountains and down the hill toward Brescia, and they still don't know who's leading. They think Taruffi is ahead of them, right?
Yeah. They think Taruffi's still in the fight. They basically think that their biggest threats are still there. They haven't seen that Fangio has stopped in Siena to have work done to the car. So there's a sense like, where is Fangio? Where is Taruffi? They're on the road somewhere, they presume. Are they ahead? Are they behind? They don't know. The only threat to them is young Hans Hermann. But unfortunately, when he's sort of sitting within 4 minutes or so of Moss and Jenks' time, which is nothing in this race, because, another run off the road that is slightly worse than the ones they've had, or a puncture, and that could be gone in an instant. But unfortunately, Hans Hermann going over one of the passes, all of a sudden, the fuel filler behind his head on the fairing pops open and fuel sloshes into the cockpit. They aren't so lucky. Hermann realizes this is happening, reaches around for his sweater that he has, and he stuffs it in the fuel filler, tries to straighten the car up, but it happens again, and they hit the side of the road. Broken wheel, out of the race. History could have been very different had he won 1955 Mille Miglia, and these are the small things that make the difference.
They're now within striking distance of the finish line. I think it's a relatively straight shot into Brescia.
Yes, it is. A pretty flat blast into Brescia, and they're waiting for a certain point on the road. because preparation being everything, Moss and Jenks have spoken before as to what they'd be prepared to do and not prepared to do to stay in this motor race. And the Mercedes team had calculated that a 300 SLR from 170 mile an hour would coast for 5 kilometers. Somebody's crunched the numbers, no AI or computers in those days, but somebody had calculated that. If you're doing 170 and you knock it out of gear, it'll roll for 5 kilometers. And Moss and Jenks had decided amongst themselves that they would be prepared to push the car for 2 kilometers at any point during the race to reach control or reach a service area or reach help. So they had it marked on their notes and they had it marked on their maps, 7 kilometers to go. And they knew once they had reached 7 kilometers to Brescia, that come hell or high water, that 300 SLR was crossing the finish line.
And indeed they do. In a total elapsed time of 10 hours, 7 minutes, 48 seconds, a new record, and a record that will never be broken.
At the finish, just over 10 hours later, it's Moss who crosses the line to win in record time. Fangio comes second and Malioli third, making Moss the first British driver ever to win this famous race.
97.96 miles per hour average speed for 1,000 miles on Italian roads in 1955. 8 or 9 mile an hour higher than the previous record average speed. An incredible result, incredible speed. And circumstance would say that it would never be beaten. The 1956 Mille Miglia would turn out to be a really, really wet race. It was horrible weather. And the 1957 Mille Miglia, which ultimately would be the last Mille Miglia that would be held, the winner's speed was just nowhere near that. They couldn't touch the speed of Moss and Jenkinson on that Mercedes-Benz on that May Day in 1955. Remarkable man, remarkable car.
And yet they don't know that they've won until really they're out of the car, right?
Yeah, they're greeted by crowds. They're greeted by Neubauer, you've won. And they didn't believe it for a while until all their cars came across the line. And ultimately when Fangio crossed the line, Fangio, I think in the end, ended up maybe about on time, about 30 minutes behind him. And remarkable scenes. They're swept up by people. They're put into a police car, whisked away, high spirits, just off the scale celebration. And the Italians have been beaten on their home ground, on the Mille Miglia, by 2 Englishmen and a car from Stuttgart.
The best that the Italians can manage is Umberto Malioli in 3rd place for Scuderia Ferrari. Fangio is 2nd. John Fitch is in 5th place in a gull wing. So pretty good showing for Mercedes-Benz.
That was a fantastic drive by Fitch. Fitch had a journalist with him who wasn't a motoring journalist, I don't think, who wasn't a tremendous help, but I think Fitch did try to do something along the lines of some sort of notes, but it was nowhere near the scale of what Moss and Jenkinson did. But Fitch put in a fantastic drive. That was a stellar drive to beat with the power and the reliability of the Mercedes-Benz to outlast so many of the Italian cars, but to beat so many cars of higher classes to come home with that result really, really was something. Fantastic result all around.
And yet, with this triumph for Mercedes, a month later, it's a dark day because on June 11th, there's a terrible accident at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. The primary car involved is a 300 SLR driven by Pierre Levegh. The car strikes the back of Lance Macklin's Austin Healey, which essentially becomes a ramp. Levegh is airborne and goes into the wattle fencing alongside the grandstands. Over 80 spectators are killed. Of course, Levegh dies. The car burns. We mentioned the Electron earlier, that magnesium alloy, and it just burns tremendously. And Moss and Fangio are both in the 24 Hours of Le Mans as Mercedes team drivers. And in the aftermath of the accident, there's a kind of a cascade of things that happen. The first of which is that Mercedes withdraws from the race.
Yes, this accident happened about 2.5, 3 hours into the race. In a race where Hawthorne on the Jaguar and Fangio on the 300 SLR were attacking it like a Grand Prix. It was a really fast opening section and it was time for the pit stops, and that's how that whole melee and that whole confusion, the silliness that caused this horror. Of course, then Neubauer made a call back to Stuttgart to get ahead of the situation, and the board in Stuttgart called an emergency meeting, and they sent the word back, I think by midnight, to Neubauer with the decision, get out of there, which was obviously the right thing. And I think about 1:30 in the morning, Neubauer went out and flagged down the cars, and the Moss Fangio 300 SLR, unusually they were sharing a car. There was two drivers in that car, and they were leading at the time by quite a long way. And yep, they packed up and went home. It was just horrible, and it was the right thing to do. Jaguar went on to win it, and that was mixed publicity for them as well. That was an awkward situation, to say the least. It was such a huge thing, and it impacted so much of motor racing. And races were cancelled, Formula One races were cancelled, and sports car races were cancelled because it was off the scale. It was the biggest disaster that had been in the sport at that time. But eventually racing returned later that summer. The Formula One returned, and the Sports Car World Championship continued. And it continued here, actually, just outside Belfast for the RAC Tourist Trophy at Dundrod in September. By that time, the word was that Mercedes-Benz were not going to continue with Formula One for 1956. By that stage, I was pretty much certain. Certainly within Mercedes-Benz, that was known. That was what was going to happen. But the Sports Car Championship looked like it was still going to continue into 1956 and beyond. And to that end, development had continued on the 300 SLR racing cars. There was an advanced version made looking towards 1956, and there was two coupe versions made of the 300 SLR, and those were planned for the Carrera Panamericana of 1955, which was cancelled because of the Le Mans disaster. The thinking there being that they couldn't race through Central America in an open top car; they would need cover. So the coupe versions were built for that. So it was up in the air, but the Sports Car Championship continued. There was talk at the end of the summer that Mercedes maybe wouldn't continue with the championship, that the board of management would rather have them do promotional tours instead of doing some of the rounds of the championship. But then they had such a huge result over here in Northern Ireland, the Dundrod TT so outstandingly that they were back in the hunt for the Manufacturers' Championship. Neubauer convinced the board that they had to attend the Targa Florio, which had been boosted to a World Championship round to compensate for other races that had been cancelled earlier in the season. And so they went to the Targa Florio and won it, and in winning it secured the Manufacturers' Sports Car Championship of 1955. But it was at the Targa Florio that Neubauer learned that the sports cars program would be cancelled as well. And so upon the return to Stuttgart, the cars were ceremonially retired, and at a press conference, the Silver Arrows were covered up. And that was the end of that remarkable era of the Silver Arrow racers from Stuttgart.
What a story. Alfred Neubauer having essentially nothing left to do at Mercedes and being of advanced age, I think he was in his late 60s by this time, decides to retire.
Mm-hmm. I think if I remember rightly, I think the Daimler-Benz rules of retirement at 65, I think maybe applied to him as much as
I see
a member of staff anywhere else in the organization. Again, another example of how the racing team is just an extension of the greater company. Neubauer ceases to be racing manager as the racing program finishes, and his position is effectively filled by Carl Kling, who steps up to be, for what it's worth, in charge of racing programs. And while there's no factory works racing happening, it had been the case really through the century that in quiet times like that, Mercedes-Benz would support privateers doing different things, would sort of give a bit of factory support here and there. So there was that kind of thing happening, and a rallying program came out of that. But at one point in the press, it was mentioned not long after Mercedes finished the sports car program, there was a suggestion that perhaps Mercedes-Benz would build a handful of 300 SLRs and sell them to private customers, which was closed down quite quickly, but it was in the air for a while. And famously, Stirling Moss said, "Thank God they didn't do that, because I didn't want to have to race against them."
Moss is known as the greatest driver who never won a world championship in Formula One. And why was that?
Stirling went his own path. And Stirling aligned himself with British racing cars for a lot of his career. And very early in his career, Stirling was pissed off by Enzo Ferrari. Stirling won that Dundroyd TT for Jaguar at a very early age. And off the back of that, Enzo Ferrari sent him an invite to go down to Bari to race in Italy, to race one of the Formula 2 Ferraris. This was it. This was a big opportunity. And he was, whatever age he was 21 or 22, something like that. And Stirling and his father made the journey all the way across there to the far side of Italy, made it all the way down to the race. Arrived in the paddock. Oh, there's a Ferrari team all set up. Stirling jumped into one of the F2 cars to get a feel for it. And the mechanic says, "Who are you? Get out of that car." And it turns out Enzo Ferrari had changed his mind, hadn't told anybody, and Stirling Moss didn't have a drive and had come all that way for nothing. So that was the start of Stirling Moss for 10 years doing everything he possibly could to beat those bloody red cars. So Stirling, as I say, the private Maserati, which he kept on. He raced for Mercedes-Benz. And off the back of that, following Mercedes withdrawal, he went to the Van Wall team, the new team being set up by Tony Vandervelde in England. And from there then raced privately entered cars by Rob Walker. Stirling found a niche for himself, and he did Grand Prix racing in his own way and was very forward-thinking in that regard and enjoyed it and had some enormous days and finished second in the championship so many times, but it just never happened. And my thoughts on it really is that the fact that Stirling was never Formula One world champion is proof that being Formula One world champion doesn't always mean an awful lot. There's bigger things in motor racing, and there's bigger things. You can leave your stamp on the world and leave your stamp on life in motor racing without having to worry about any of this championship nonsense.
Just a nerdy note here. You mentioned Rob Walker. He was the heir to the Walker distillery fortune, right? As in Johnny Walker.
As in Johnny Walker. Yep, that's right. That's right. Yep, and raced kind of in Scottish colours and the blue with the white band across the nose.
In April 1962, Moss is at, I think, a Formula One race at Goodwood, and he crashes, and it's a very serious crash. It leaves him in a coma for a month. He's got paralysis on the left side of his body for a good 6 months after the accident, and he attempts to return, but doesn't feel right in the car. He feels like he's lost his edge, and he decides to retire. A young man.
Yep. And I think ultimately, years down the line, he came to the conclusion that he tried to return too soon, and that perhaps he'd given himself a bit longer. His feeling was that when he came back to it, he was able to drive. He's just a talented, experienced guy. But what he felt when he tried to make a comeback or did some testing to see if he wanted to come back, he felt that he had to concentrate on it much more, that what previously came natural, what previously was instinctive, he now had to focus to achieve. And he felt in that regard that something was lost. And as I say, in later years, I think maybe he thought that he just probably should have given himself more time. I look at it slightly differently because we're talking about 1962, 1963, and Stirling has said, "Oh, I could have raced until the 1970s. I could have raced until 1973 or 1974," which is bonkers when you think about it.
It is.
But I actually think, to be honest, that accident at Goodwood probably saved Stirling Moss's life. When you look at that next 10 years of motor racing, the chances of him making it through it unscathed are probably very slim, just time exposed to danger. And I think, as I say, Stirling Moss is bigger than Formula One. And I think having Mr. Motor Racing in this world as an icon and as an example, and for decades being out there in the world as Stirling Moss, the character and the icon and the inspiration, I I think that's worth much more to motor racing and to motor racing fans than another 10 years chasing a championship that doesn't matter.
I couldn't agree with you more, Colin. It most certainly saved his life. And he became the dean of the sport and, traveled kind of as an ambassador worldwide and was seen at various events. He was a bridge between the two eras, let's say the golden era of the 1950s and the modern day. Something interesting I learned about Stirling, his name was in the London phone book, just listed, no frills. He said he preferred to use a van around London because he could park it anywhere and look like a tradesman and he wouldn't get a ticket. Simon Taylor once told me that he took a ride around London on the back of a Vespa with Stirling. So they were riding two up and the guy drove like a demon through the London streets and scared Simon to death. Just a character.
Just a character. And also he had rental properties that he owned around London. He was a landlord and that was a wee business he had. But if you phoned up and said, I've got a burst water pipe, or the washing machine's not working, or this electric switch is broken, Stirling would turn up himself with his toolkit and do the odd jobs in his property. So, a fantastic character and a remarkable man. And as you say, an icon in it was that bridge. And thinking back, for so many years then, he appeared at what now is called the Mille Miglia, which is a glorious celebration of that old race, a reliability road rally, effectively, for cars that appeared in it back in the day. And Stirling, for so many years, went to that race to be seen and to see, and so often was at the wheel of an old Mercedes-Benz, and sometimes, quite often, an old 300 SLR. And certainly some of my favourite memories of that race and that car come from the 1990s and TV documentaries and features about Stirling being reunited with that car. And that's where probably the passion for this particular story comes from, seeing him back. And as you say, Stirling was such a great ambassador for our sport. Sir Stirling Moss.
Yeah, absolutely. Stirling died in 2020 at the ripe old age of 90. I never had the good fortune to meet him, but the stories live on.
Yep, I don't know if anybody could ever replace him. We have so many around Formula One. We have so many grandees. We have our Jackie Stewarts and we have our Emerson Fittipaldis who are now getting on in age and are the grandees of the sport. Nobody has the gravitas and the cultural significance of Stirling Moss, because in Britain in that era in the 1950s, he was the great hope. He was the boy, and he was in the sports pages. He was going out and winning for Britain. And I don't think anybody else ever touched that sort of, that connection. Perhaps maybe a Nigel Mansell character, but nobody who's as fondly regarded so widely as there ever been than Stirling Moss.
Couldn't agree more. Colin Johnston, once again, the website racingdaydreams.com and on socials at CJ Grand Prix. Check him out. Colin, thank you so much. I had a great time.
It's been great. I've loved it, and it's been fantastic to be on Horsepower Heritage. Thank you so much to you and to all your listeners for making me so welcome.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. If you like what you've heard, don't forget to support the podcast at buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage. Leave 5 stars and a quick review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and follow Horsepower Heritage on Instagram and YouTube. And until next time, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.